tree seminar. It's nice to see many people here from our local Triangle community. And we're pleased also to welcome guests from across the country and indeed around the world. So thanks for joining us today. Shout out to the University of British Columbia and LSE and Iowa State and the Ohio State and UPenn, Nebraska, and others. And welcome to our guests from Brazil, Argentina, and France. Indeed, welcome to all of you. Tree Seminar is jointly sponsored by Duke, NC State University, and RTI International. Eric Edwards is your co-host, and the Tree Steering Committee is comprised of he and I, as well as Billy Pizer and Chris Timmons from Duke University, and Harrison Fell and Roger Von Hafen from NC State. We're pleased today to welcome Clare Balboni to Tree Seminar. She is the 3M Career Development Assistant Professor of Environmental Economics in the Economics Department at MIT. And Claire is going to be talking to us today about infrastructure investments and the persistence of coastal cities. Before I welcome Claire to our virtual podium here, let me just describe the format for this virtual seminar. First of all, this is a seminar and not a webinar, so we welcome and encourage engagement throughout Claire's presentation, as we would expect if this seminar were occurring in person. To try and facilitate this, we encourage those who have questions or comments to raise their hands using the raise hand feature of Zoom, and then Claire can call on these individuals who should then unmute themselves and pose their questions or make their comments verbally. In the event that Claire might overlook someone who has a raised hand, Eric and I will be sure to direct her attention to those raised hands. I should note that as co-hosts, Eric and I actually do not have the option of raising our hands. So if we have questions or comments, we'll just interject. It'll appear as though we're breaking our own rules, but that's just a function of the Zoom technology. Also, we've enabled all the chat features and nonverbal cues, but we encourage you to pose any substantive questions or comments verbally, as it can be very difficult for the presenter to be monitoring the chat dialogue as well. So with these preliminary comments, let me again thank Claire and all of you for joining us. Claire, please take it away.
Thank you. So thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to all your comments. I will do my best to monitor the hand raising, but please do feel free to interrupt me anytime if there are hands I haven't seen or you have questions. So this is work on infrastructure investments and the persistence of coastal cities. So by way of motivation, there has throughout history been a global propensity for human settlement to favour coastal regions. And there's a very long literature that documents the historical reasons for this in terms of, for instance, advantages for natural transport, fertile soils for agriculture, and so on. So today, the coastal zone at less than 5 meters elevation contains more than 300 million people, which represents more than 5% of the world's population and just 1% of its land. So if we look to the economic history of developed countries, this suggests that over time, secular trends such as structural change out of agriculture, development of inland infrastructure networks, and so on, may erode the advantages of coastal proximity over time. And indeed, it's now widely accepted that environmental change, it may even lead to significant costs of coastal proximity, with many-fold increases in both the human and economic costs of coastal disasters projected over the next century or so. So in this context, the key question that this paper is going to aim to address is whether infrastructure investments should be continuing to favour coastal regions, given what we know about the changing fortunes of coasts. So in particular, if we look globally, we see that coasts continue to attract a very large, oftentimes even a growing share of major types of infrastructure investments. So the focus of this paper is going to be on roads. And if we take this as an example and look at the density of major roads worldwide, the density in this low elevation coastal zone is double the global average, and this has been increasing in recent decades. So the aim here is going to be to consider whether this allocation is optimal given changing coastal fortunes. And I'm going to be doing this firstly using, by developing a dynamic multi-region spatial equilibrium model and then combining the model with detailed georeferenced data from an illustrative country. So I will be looking in particular at investments in the road network in Vietnam over the period 2000 to 2010, which was a period of really major investment in Vietnam's road infrastructure network. I'm then going to combine these by using the structure of the model to estimate the impacts of both the realized road investments that were made and a series of counterfactual allocations of the same total investment in the road network, both with and without accounting for the effects of environmental change. So I show here on the left-hand panel the road network in Vietnam at the beginning of my study period in 2000. In the right-hand panel, the road network at the end of the study period in 2010. And what you can see here is that the road investments made over this period are very strongly concentrated along Vietnam's eastern seacoast and in the low-lying regions of the Red River Delta up here in the northeast, and then the southern Mekong River Delta. And really the puzzle that's at the heart of this paper is the following. So those regions that saw these particularly strong concentration of investments are exactly those regions, large portions of which are projected to face permanent inundation over the next century or so. So just before turning to the details, to give a quick preview of the results, the estimation is going to suggest that the road investments that were made in this context did lead to significant welfare gains. So in particular, my central estimates will suggest that the net present value of aggregate welfare was about 1.75% higher than it would have been in the absence of these investments having been made. But the estimates are also going to suggest that these were not allocated optimally, and in particular, I will find that a more foresighted allocation avoiding the most vulnerable regions would have achieved welfare gains 72% higher. So interestingly, I'm going to find that there would have been significant gains from allocating these upgrades further inland, even before accounting for the effects of future sea level rise. And I'll talk about those results in the results section. But the difference there is going to be strongly magnified once I account for the effects of future inundation. So here's an outline for today's talk. I'll firstly start by talking through the data that I use in the analysis here. So the analysis is going to be at the level of Vietnam's district. So this is the second level administrative division in Vietnam, and there are 541 of these units that are consistent over my study period. So I take geographic data from the Columbia Earth Sciences Network, district level population and 5-year migration rates from the Vietnam census. In terms of the economic data, I'm going to use two sources of data on the wage at the district level. The first has the advantage of being a census. So this is data from the Vietnam Enterprise Census. However, this has the significant shortcoming that this only covers formal sector firms, which represents a reasonably small share of activity in this context. So I mean, everything I show you will be robust to using either of these, but my preferred estimates are going to use district level expenditure per capita based on the Vietnam Household Living Standards Survey. The third key component of the data I will be using is data on the transport network. And so this is going to come from maps, transport network maps from 2000 and 2010 that I digitized for Vietnam's 3 core modes of transportation over this period. So this is roads, inland waterways, and coastal shipping routes. Railways over this period had very, very low utilization rates and weren't competitive over any haulage length, so I will abstract from the railway network. So in each of these types of transportation, I allow for different categories. So for instance, in the case of roads, highways, dual carriageways, major roads, minor roads, and other roads, and for differences on different slopes. And I then assign to each stretch of the network for each of these modes 3 types of cost. So the first is going to be a direct cost per kilometer to account for fuel and so on. The second is time cost, and the third then will be a mobilization charge, which is essentially necessary to account for the fact that coastal shipping is very cheap once you get going, but it's very expensive to start. So based on this constructed transport network in these 2 time periods, I then find the lowest cost route between all of each bilateral pair of districts based on the Dijkstra algorithm. Finally, all of the counterfactuals that I will consider are going to be cost neutral in the following sense. So I will overlay a 1 kilometer squared grid across the whole of Vietnam that accounts for differences across space in the cost of construction of roads or upgrading of roads based on slope, whether or not the area is built up, whether it's over water or whether it's over wetland. And based on these differences in costs across space, I can see there's a hand, I'll just finish my sentence. I ensure that the cost neutrality of the counterfactuals considered. Yes, I can see there's a question.
Hey, Claire, it's Chris Simmons.
Hi.
So I had a question with respect to the cost of construction, and it's largely one built on the way this happens in the US, so maybe totally irrelevant for Vietnam. But oftentimes what we see is that the cheap land is the land that's in disadvantaged communities, and a lot of infrastructure gets built by basically going in with eminent domain and buying up land in predominantly neighborhoods of color. And oftentimes when you get around the coast, those neighborhoods are also the neighborhoods that flood really easily because they were built there. They were given that land a long time ago because it floods. So I could see this actually coming out of a very different mechanism. You're going to explain your mechanism more, but I could see this mechanism in the US coming out of that sort of a pattern. And I was just wondering if there's anything like that we should be thinking about with Vietnam, or is it totally?
Yeah, so I mean, a really interesting question. I will say that I'm not going to be able to speak to that very much in the results of my estimation here. I will say that one thing I am working on right at the moment actually is taking a series of data that is available on specific stretches of the upgraded network that I can geocode where there is good cost data available, and trying to, partly for the purposes of testing how appropriate this cost grid function is for capturing the relevant aspects of it, but would also presumably allow me to get at other factors like this. I am in the process of working on that, so I'm afraid I don't have the results of that exercise yet. More generally, I think there's a really, really interesting set of questions around related political economy factors that feed into these allocation decisions. I will talk a little bit more about that when I get to the results, and in particular, a series of kind of potential explanations to try and rationalize what looks like coastal favoritism in my estimates, and this is certainly one of them. It's sort of somewhat beyond the scope of this paper to try to model explicitly the government's objective function over distribution between groups and these sorts of things, but I certainly, the results will point to these factors, these types of factors being important, and I mention them in the paper, but stop short of estimating the contribution of each of these political economy factors to the results. But it's a really important set of issues. Thank you. So before turning to the model, I will just briefly present a series of motivating facts based on this data in this context, which also helps to motivate some of the key features of the model. So Vietnam is historically, in common with much of developing Asia in particular, agrarian economy with both population and economic activity very strongly concentrated in low-lying coastal and deltaic regions. So as I said previously, in the Red River Delta here surrounding Hanoi, the Mekong River Delta to the south of Ho Chi Minh City, and then these coastal seaports. And as we see on the right-hand panel, these correspond very closely with the particularly low-lying regions of the low elevation coastal zone. There has, however, been, beginning with a wide-ranging series of economic reforms in Vietnam beginning in the late 1980s, a shift inland in the locus of economic activity. So this has accompanied drastic structural change out of agriculture and rapid development of the inland transport network. And there's been then this commensurate decline in the coastal population share and slower wage growth in coastal regions relative to the country average. Compounding this, Vietnam is already highly and certainly increasingly geographically vulnerable, so the coastal regions are increasingly exposed to high intensity typhoons and accelerating sea level rise. And to give some sense of the importance of this, a 1 meter rise in the sea level, which is sort of well within the bounds of what's expected over the next century or so, would inundate 5% of Vietnam's land area, of course, much more than that in the low-lying delta regions. And yet, despite these trends, the development strategy here continues to favor the growth of urban areas in coastal and low-lying regions. As I've said, I'm going to be focusing on road investments. So road investments over this period were very significant, so reaching more than 3.5% of GDP by the end of the period. I should say that this is almost exclusively investments in road upgrades. So the total length of the road network increased by less than 1%, but what there really was significant investment in was upgrading of low-level roads to more major roads, so major roads, dual carriageways and highways. So the length of those main types of roads increased by more than 150% across the country and over 260% in the coastal zone. And at the district level, even if we control for land area and population, we still see differential improvements in coastal districts. So there is, at this stage, a reasonably large literature, including in developing country contexts, looking at the local impacts of road infrastructure investments. Vietnam is a context that has received reasonably limited attention in this literature. So in a first part of the analysis here, before turning to the core structural exercise, I will present some simple reduced form evidence on the local effects of road upgrades in Vietnam. There are sort of well-known challenges in this type of estimation associated with endogenous placement, which I will try to overcome using a section of the upgraded network over this period that has a predetermined historical origin. And that source of predetermined variation that I will be relying on is going to come from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a Vietnam War era logistical supply route that was constructed in the late 1960s, early 1970s, for the purposes of avoiding US aerial bombing during the Vietnam War. So the reason to think this is at all relevant to the matter at hand is that in 1997, the government of Vietnam announced the construction of a 2,000-kilometer highway following the route of the historical Ho Chi Minh Trail. So this was partly to connect less advantaged regions in the west of the country, but has also largely been recognized as sort of patriotic, politically motivated project. So, of course, while the route of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not chosen with reference to future growth in economic activity, of course, it wasn't chosen randomly either. It was chosen, as I say, for the purposes of avoiding US aerial bombing, and so low-lying regions with low-lying fog, mountainous terrain, and so on. Conveniently for my purposes, the relevant characteristics are a series of climatic and geographical features that I can and do control for. I also include controls for war damage using the Miguel and Roland data set and for pre-existing economic conditions. So the simple reduced form here is going to suggest that indeed proximity to this Ho Chi Minh Trail is associated with increases in local economic activity at the district level over the period of the construction of the Ho Chi Minh National Highway, though not prior to that. But if we look at the IV estimates, the key takeaway here is that the IV estimates are indeed consistent with proximity to an upgraded road as instrumented by proximity to the trail being associated with either the growth or the attraction of economic activity at the district level. But really importantly, this is sort of intended to, I'll just finish my sentence, I see there's a hand there. This is intended to demonstrate using this source of variation that the investments in these road improvements do seem material for the distribution of economic activity, but really importantly, this isn't going to allow us to distinguish between those two things, whether this is reallocation or aggregate growth, and that's going to be one of the key motivations for then turning to the structural part of the paper, which I will do next. But I will first take the question.
Hi, Claire. So there were some parts of like the Ho Chi Minh Trail that were in Laos and Cambodia. So when you are calculating the distance, are you considering these parts or only the parts in Vietnam?
No, I'm going to use only the parts on which I have data. So I will consider, you're absolutely right. There was a very extensive network of the trail that extended through neighboring countries. I'm going to be using only the variation from within Vietnam. And indeed, it's the sections within Vietnam that the Ho Chi Minh National Highway was aimed to trace. But you're absolutely right. There was a much more extensive network in neighboring countries as well. So turning to the structural part of the paper, before describing the details of the model, I just want to briefly set out some of the key features, so the choices I've made in outlining the specification for the model and the reasons for doing so in the context of the question that I'm trying to answer. So the first I've just touched upon in the previous section, which is that I want to be able to account for the fact that roads have general equilibrium effects, as is well documented, and because they lead to potentially lead to both reallocation and growth, I want to be able to account for this. So I will be using a spatial general equilibrium setup, building on recent advances in the spatial equilibrium literature. The second sort of key characteristic that I want the model to have is that I want to be able to account for the fact that coasts might just be different. And indeed, there are reasons, several reasons to expect that coasts might have particular productivity characteristics. So for instance, fertile soils for agriculture and so on. They might have particular amenity advantages. So people just like living near the coast because of nice climates and nice views and so on. And most certainly coasts have obvious advantages in terms of trading links. So I will accommodate heterogeneity across space along all of these dimensions using a multi-region economic geography model. Thirdly, this literature has to date been very predominantly a static literature, but here I'm asking a series of questions that are inherently dynamic. So in particular, I want to account for the fact that where I decide to allocate roads today affects activity today, but it also affects the distribution of economic activity in future periods. And the second reason for this is, of course, that the changes in the economic geography and in the locational fundamentals that I will be playing around with here will not be realized until future periods. So I allow for these effects by incorporating a dynamic setup, building on these approaches in Artuk et al.'s 2010 AER paper and a more recent econometric paper by Lorenzo Caliendo and others. And finally, this is a context in which most surely frictions are going to be very important. So I want to allow for that and not make the extreme assumptions about, for instance, free mobility that are often made in other contexts. So the model will incorporate imperfect mobility of both goods and workers. So with that sort of motivation for the model's characteristics in mind, at a very high level, the components of the model are simply going to be workers who choose their location of residence and their consumption of both goods and land. I will then have monopolistically competitive firms who choose the price of their goods varieties. And at the core of the model will simply be these optimization problems combined with the market clearing conditions to yield three key equilibrium conditions that I will talk through shortly. First, an expression for the expected lifetime utility of a representative agent in each location, then a gravity equation for the flow of goods in each period, and finally a gravity equation for migration flows. So the setup then of the model is as follows. So there are n locations indexed by I in discrete time periods, each of which are going to be endowed with an innate productivity value, an innate amenity value, and then a supply of residential land. There will then, and the initial population distribution is going to be L in period 0. So just to be very clear about the parts of this that I'm going to be playing with in my counterfactuals, the first thing that I will be altering in my counterfactual simulations will be the investments in the road network. That will manifest itself through changes in the trade cost matrix. So as I improve roads, it will become less costly to trade along the upgraded links. And the second key part of the counterfactual simulations is going to be simulating the effects of changes in the sea level. that's going to appear in two ways in the model. The first is through the land supply. So as the sea level rises, those districts that see a contraction, that see some of their land becoming inundated, will see a contraction in the available land supply H. And the second effect is going to come through the trade cost matrix, and in particular, as the sea level rises and inundates particular stretches of the road network, those stretches are going to become more costly to traverse, and that's going to affect the trade cost matrix B. So the timing then of the model is as follows. So agents will start the period in a location N. That is the location in which they will work, earn, and consume. And then at the end of period T, they will face a choice of either staying where they are or moving to any other location and incurring the relevant migration cost. That's the location in which they work, earn, and consume in the next period. They can then move again, and so on. So on the worker side, the setup of the problem then is as follows. So the lifetime utility of a worker in a location N at a time T is going to be defined over their consumption of consumption goods. This in turn is going to be defined over an endogenous measure M of goods varieties. Then over their consumption of residential land. And then their choice of a location I in which they will reside in the next period, which is chosen to maximize the following aggregate term. So this is firstly the discounted continuation value, net of the cost of getting there. So this is the cost of reaching location I from location N, plus the fixed amenity value of the destination region I, plus then this term little b. So this term little b is going to represent the idiosyncratic preference shocks that agents have across locations. Sort of practically speaking, the reason that I need this term is that in the data I see concurrent migration in opposite directions between the same two locations. So this heterogeneous preference shock across locations is going to rationalize that in the data. And in common with the literature, I'm going to choose an extreme value distribution in order to permit a tractable aggregation of decisions here. So that's the worker problem. On the firm side, each firm is going to use labor at a common wage rate W to produce a distinct variety. There will be, as I said earlier, fixed costs in production that are going to yield increasing returns to scale. So the cost of producing XJ units of a variety J in terms of labor units is going to be this fixed cost, plus then a variable cost that depends on productivity in that location. Production occurs under conditions of monopolistic competition, and so as in canonical models in the new economic geography literature, this combination of increasing returns to scale, together with the fact that consumers love variety and it's costly to trade across regions, is going to be the source of an agglomeration force in the model. This is going to be offset by a dispersion force, and this brings us to the land side. So land income in the central estimates, though I can relax this in all sorts of ways, but in the central estimates, land income is going to be distributed to local workers in proportion to their labor units, and this the land market clearing condition is then going to yield an equilibrium land rent that takes the following form. What this reveals is that as the population L in a location increases, the rental rate increases, and that's going to be a source of dispersion in the model. Okay, so that's the setup of the model. Turning to the key three equilibrium conditions that I use the model to derive that I mentioned earlier. The first of these is going to be the expression for the expected lifetime utility of a representative agent. And that's going to obtain by taking the expectation over these preference shock terms. So sort of several pages of algebra later, it's going to yield this really quite intuitive form for the expected lifetime utility of a representative agent. And in particular, it's going to be the sum of the current period utility and then the option value to move into any other market in the subsequent period. This convenient form of the distribution of the preference shocks is also going to yield a somewhat intuitive and interpretable expression for the migration shares, which is going to be the second key equilibrium condition here. And in particular, we can use the distribution to derive migration shares as the probability that for an agent who starts the period in location N, it will be location I that offers the highest expected utility of all of the possible destinations that they could have chosen, including staying where they are. And again, sort of working that all through will eventually yield the following expression for the migration shares. And what this is showing the migration share from location N to location I. Intuitively, what we find here is that migrants are going to be attracted, so these enter positively, excuse me, by higher expected lifetime utilities and higher values for this fixed amenity term B. And they're going to be deterred by higher costs of migration and mu IN from location N to location I. Okay, the population distribution is then going to obtain mechanically from the population shares equation and the fact that we specified the initial distribution of the population across regions in an initial period. The final equilibrium condition is going to be the gravity equation for goods flows. So this obtains in a very standard way from profit maximization and the zero profit condition combined with labor market clearing to yield a sort of very standard looking gravity equation. I do, however, just want to spend a couple of minutes on some important aspects of the gravity equation that are going to be important in this context and for this question. So the first of these is that this equation here is perfectly amenable to incorporating international as well as intranational trade. But to do so, I'd need information on the population and the wage and so on in all of Vietnam's international as well as international trading partner regions. And that's something that's very difficult to obtain a credible estimate of. So, but I most surely want to incorporate international trade in the model, particularly given that we might think coastal proximity is of course linked to international trading possibilities. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to incorporate international trade without needing this sort of very, very difficult to obtain data, using this convenient market access formulation pioneered in the work of Dave Donaldson and Rick Hornbeck and others, which essentially allows me to write the gravity equation in terms of this market access expression. And therefore, the only information I'm going to need in this formulation is the total value of international exports, E, and then the cost dxk of reaching foreign markets from each interior location k. So this is a new piece of data that I'm going to need. I'm going to approximate that as follows. So the international trade cost dxn, so this is the cost of reaching foreign markets from an interior location n at time t. I'm going to model as the sum of the cost of reaching the nearest international port from each location. So this I calculate in the same way as any other interior trading costs. So using the network, using the Disher algorithm along the networks from each location to the nearest international port. And then following the work of Nate Baum-Snow and others, I'm going to assume that the cost of reaching foreign markets from an international port is 15% of the average of this, this cost of reaching the nearest international port from interior locations. Yes, I see a raised hand.
Sorry, does the level of E just enter exogenously then, or will Vietnam up its exports when they have better ports?
Yes, so in the initial period, yeah, so in 2010, which is going to be the date from which I start my simulations, it's going to enter as a data point, and I'm just going to take that from the Vietnamese export statistics. In the central estimate, so it's an excellent point and a very important one. In the central estimates, I'm going to assume that the real value of output in the rest of the world is constant over time. But of course, we might expect that, for instance, the importance of international exports continue to increase, and this might be part of the explanation for investing in infrastructure near the coast and so on. So in the kind of extensions part of the paper, I'm then going to make some pretty extreme assumptions about continued growth in the importance of international exports. And I can read, so this E has a T on it. So I'm essentially going to impose a future path for exports. And it's not going, so the sort of key results that I'm going to show you are going to be robust to doing that as well. But can show you a bit more once we do the simulations where that is. I've got something flashing and I think another hand and something happening in the chat. So you tell me how I should go about responding to these sequentially.
Claire, this is Steve. Why don't you take Billy's question? I think Billy had a question. I think it was Billy's hand.
Sure.
Now the hand has been lowered.
Well, I was doing that to just clear the queue.
Okay.
This is, I mean, I'm just kind of trying to follow this, and I was just curious about that 15% surcharge that goes for international. Is there some intuition to that? Because I guess I would have imagined that the international surcharge would have kind of reflected international trading costs, not the average of domestic trading costs. So I was just, is there any intuition?
Yeah, no, so I quite agree. It's a number that it's difficult to make precise. This is in the interest of trying to make, I certainly want to be incorporating international trade. This is in the interest of trying to do so in a way that's as tractable as possible. So this is an estimate that I take from the literature on the basis of, admittedly, other contexts where this is a central estimate that has sort of emerged from that literature. I haven't, to be honest, this is one of the few robustness exercises that I haven't yet done, but I could certainly look into how sensitive the results are to that number, and that's not something I've done. So thanks for the suggestion.
And Claire's, so Brendo, I guess, is not in a position to speak up. And so he's asking that I read out this question in the chat to you. And he's butchering names in his question, and I'm going to butcher his question. But so Brendo is asking about this amenity B. Can it be that it's low lying? In other words, that the worker or people like to be close to the water, as is perhaps implied by the DeGrolio paper. Essentially, people like living in low-lying areas, all else equal, and thus it draws road investments.
So that's exactly what the big B term is meant to capture. So that allows for fixed differences across space. So it might be that people just like low-lying regions. It might be that they like the climates that are associated with that, or the views associated with that, or any of the other features associated with these coastal regions. That is captured in V. One caveat to that is that in what I've shown you so far, that is only captured in B to the extent it's time invariant, because I'm going to be calibrating this based on today. Another extension I consider, which I may or may not have time to get to, so I'll tell you about it now, is that, so something that wouldn't be captured in the central estimates of what I've shown you at the moment, is that, for instance, Vietnam's a developing economy. As the economy gets richer, there is an increased value put on these types of amenities. And, the coastal amenity premium is increasing over time, something like that. So that's not captured in what I've shown you so far. Again, how I try and get at this is to impose a projected time path for the coastal amenity premium. I project it to reach Californian levels, essentially. I say, assume that there's no coastal amenity premium now, but there's a bunch of papers that estimate this in the case of the Californian coast, and that it sort of, the path of the coastal amenity premium converges towards that over time. Again, that's not going to break the central results I show you. Thank you. Great. So the second, just briefly on the second point I want to make on the gravity equation is that this log linear formulation in terms of market access lends itself to being implemented as a regression. So this is an approach that's been taken in previous papers in the literature, and this provides quite a nice way to provide a quantitative test of the model's predictions. So I do that. Here I again can use the Ho Chi Minh Trail variation to provide an instrument here. Here I'm instrumenting for the slightly more general equilibrium concept of improvements in market access. And in this case, my central estimates are going to suggest that a 1% increase in market access at the district level is associated with about a 0.47% increase. As to say on that number is pretty similar to the estimates in Donaldson and Hornbeck's paper in the Historical United States, Simon Alder's paper looking at India. So that's sort of somewhat reassuring, but what's particularly important here is that this estimate is going to be consistent with the model predicted values. So this provides some reassurance about the predictions of the model in this particular context. So bringing this all together, the sequential equilibrium here is going to be defined as the time path of the endogenous variables. So this is population, wage, market access, the migration shares, and the expected lifetime utilities, that for all locations in all time periods solves the three key equilibrium conditions I've mentioned. The final point I want to make here is that in order to close the model, I need to assume that at some point in the arbitrarily distant future, the economy converges towards a stationary equilibrium in which all of the values of the aggregate endogenous variables are constant. So people can still move, but the aggregate population will change. I tried very hard to emphasize the word arbitrarily there. So it really doesn't matter when that is in the future. And I've tried playing around with that, and you can move it hundreds of years and it doesn't matter. But the solution is going to require that at some point the economy converges towards the spatial equilibrium, the stationary equilibrium, excuse me, that most certainly doesn't need to be there in the initial period. And indeed, in my case, it's not going to be stationary in the initial period. So the expression for welfare is simply obtained by iterating forward the expression for expected lifetime utility. And here, again, the two sort of objects that I'm playing with in the counterfactuals are going to be road upgrades that we see from this expression are going to affect welfare in two ways. So firstly, roads are going to affect district level market access. That's going to have price effects. So improvements in market access will reduce prices and increase wages and feed into welfare. But importantly, in this dynamic framework, there's also going to be an endogenous migration response to that. So people's location choices will respond to that, and that's going to also affect welfare. The second, again, is the sea level. This is going to affect welfare both through the contractions in the land supply pushing up rents and through inundated roads, increasing trading costs and therefore reducing market access and affecting welfare through the same channels. Okay, so turning then to how I use the model in the estimation, the model then is used to answer this question of whether infrastructure investments should be favoring, coastal regions in the following 4 steps. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the steps rather than telling you what I'm going to do and then doing it. So the first is that I'm going to need to choose values for 4 key elasticities in the model, and these are elasticities I'm going to take from the literature. So the first is this parameter for the share of housing and consumption expenditure. This is very consistent across all rounds of the Vietnam Household Living Standards Survey in my sample period at 15%, so I'm just going to take that to be 15%. The second is going to be the discount factor. I'm going to be somewhat conservative and choose an annual discount factor of 0.96 from the macro literature, and then test the robustness to higher values of that. The migration elasticity is the subject of a sort of somewhat small literature, but the estimates that there are here, so this is a paper in Brazil, the paper in China, are reasonably tightly estimated around about 3. So I will take that as a central estimate and again test robustness. The elasticity of substitution between goods is of course the subject of very much larger literature with quite a wide range of estimates. So I will take a central estimate of 7, again supported by the reduced form implementation of the gravity equation, and I will test the robustness to varying that parameter as well. So these are the only parameters that I need to take from the literature. With those in hand, I can then use the equilibrium conditions of the model to calibrate values for market access and productivity at the district level in 2010, that are consistent with the observed data on the endogenous variables being an equilibrium outcome of the model. So what this essentially means is that I take the data in 2010, and if I see that, for instance, there's a really well-connected area but the wages are very low there, this is going to suggest that the productivity is low in that area. So I'm essentially inverting these two equilibrium conditions refer to the static subproblem. I have data on all of the endogenous outcome variables here, and I have the parameters I've imposed from the literature, and this is going to yield then the values of market access. So the two unknowns here are going to be market access and productivities across locations that are consistent with the wage and the population data being an equilibrium outcome. So if I do this calibration exercise, the results of this exercise look as follows. So on the left-hand panel, I have calibrated market access values. On the right-hand value, on the right-hand map, calibrated productivity values. And in both cases, red is going to denote higher values, blue lower values. So first, looking at market access, I mean, this looks like we would hope it to look. So calibrated market access is going to be higher in those regions that have particularly dense road networks or easy access to coastal ports. So that's reassuring. On the right-hand panel, for those of you who know the Vietnamese context, this also sort of looks somewhat intuitive and what we would hope it to look like. So the kind of key economic zones in Vietnam are the Hanoi-Hải Phòng corridor here in the north and the industrialized southeast, and key coastal cities. Those areas are showing up with as having really high calibrated productivity. So that's reassuring. For those of you who don't know the Vietnamese context or would like something a bit more systematic than the sort of eyeball test, I also correlate the calibrated productivities at the district level with out of sample TFP estimates from the Vietnam census. So this is data I haven't used in any way in the estimation yet, and I'm going to find a positive correlation between these district level estimates, which is reassuring. The third step then is going to be to use these estimates to then simulate the model forward to find the time path of the endogenous variables in the sequential equilibrium. So for the purposes of expositional clarity, in the simplest case, I will assume that the locational fundamentals are constant over time. This is something that I can and do in all sorts of ways, relax in different simulation exercises. But in the simplest case, we assume that all other locations are constant over time. To close the model, as I've said, I need to assume that a stationary equilibrium is reached at some point. So in the central estimates, I will assume that that point is 250 years hence. And then I use an iterative solution algorithm that takes the equilibrium conditions and first differences in this really nice sort of machinery for solving these problems in first differences based on Caliendo et al.'s work. And this is essentially an algorithm that allows one to propagate backwards using the fact that we've got an assumed stationarity at some future period, and we've got the initial 5-year migration rates. In order to yield the time path of the endogenous variables on their path towards the stationary steady state. Okay, I didn't see any hands, but let me know if there are any. No, okay. So turning then to the counterfactual simulations. So I use then exactly the same estimation procedure to consider whether upgrades of the same cost but allocated elsewhere could have achieved higher gains. So the first exercise is going to be estimating the effects of the realized upgrades by simulating the effects of their removal. So the steps I've just shown you simulate forward under the status quo. What does the forward path of the endogenous variables and the implied welfare look like under the status quo? I then remove all of the road upgrades made over this 2000 to 2010 period, re-simulate everything, and estimate the implied welfare change, and then do exactly the same thing with a series of counterfactual allocations that could have been made, and I will describe how I choose those. What I first want to note here is that I will be doing everything here under 2 sea level rise scenarios. So the first scenario is a 1 meter rise in the sea level realized gradually over the next 100 years. So this is sort of central estimate of what we think is actually going to happen. I'm going to implement this incrementally. So my simulation period is 5 years because I have 5-year migration data. So in each 5-year period, there will be an incremental reduction in the land area and increase in the cost of trading along roads that lie below 1 meter's elevation, such that in 100 years' time, all land and roads below 1 meter elevation are going to be entirely submerged. The second scenario I consider, in light of the fact that, so I'm giving the game away a bit here, but it's probably not a huge surprise that I'm going to find evidence that there is misallocation in this case. But what I want to understand here is that this potentially reflects two things. So firstly, I've shown you that the road upgrades are very coastally concentrated. Here we're allowing for inundation of coastal areas. And so potentially some share of this misallocation can be attributed to the fact that these road upgrades have been made in vulnerable areas, and some share of them will be lost to sea level rise. But there's also the possibility here that some share of that misallocation is driven by entirely orthogonal sources of misallocation. So it might be that even in the absence of future sea level rise, there were just higher gains to market access improvements elsewhere. And there's lots of reasons in a large literature suggesting that even notwithstanding the effects of sea level rise, these types of infrastructure allocations are not made optimally. So in order to try and disentangle those two things, I'm then going to resimulate all of my counterfactuals in a scenario in which there is no future sea level rise. So the counterfactual networks that I consider are as follows. So these are going to be based on objective rules of thumb and metrics used by transport planners in other contexts. So the idea here is that these are sort of implementable rules that have a direct interpretation, and they are not in any way derived from the model. So these counterfactuals are not model dependent. It is a result that all of the counterfactuals I show you will induce population declines in coastal areas relative to the status quo. So as you'll see, in some of the counterfactuals, that's extremely unsurprising because I constrain them to avoid coastal areas, so we would expect that to be the case. But the first two counterfactuals I will show you are implemented as sort of objective rules of thumb that don't consider the effects of future sea level rise. And it turns out that those are also going to be less coastally concentrated relative to the status quo. For simplicity here, wherever I present the welfare gain, that's going to be measured relative to the baseline where there's no road upgrades at all. So either the status quo welfare gains, which I simulate by simulating the effect of their removal, or any of the welfare gains associated with any of the counterfactual networks are going to be relative to the scenario in which nothing had been, no upgrades at all had been made over this period. So turning to what these maps look like. So this is a map you've seen before here. This is the actual road network of Vietnam in 2010. What the right-hand panel shows is the distribution of upgrades between 2000 and 2010 implied. And again, the sort of key point of looking at this map is that there's a particularly strong concentration of upgrades here in these coastal and deltaic regions. So that's the first simulation I'm going to run. If I removed all of these upgrades, what were the welfare gains associated with the realized allocation of road upgrades? The second then counterfactual I consider is going to be a simple rule of thumb that has formed the basis of road infrastructure allocation decisions in other contexts, so in Brazil and China elsewhere, which is a simple rule of thumb that aims to connect the major administrative divisions. And in particular, how I implement this here is to find the least cost path between all of Vietnam's provinces. So this is the first level administrative division in Vietnam, and upgrade that to a dual carriageway. So that would have looked as follows, mechanically. This is going to be more evenly distributed across space because it's having to reach all provinces. The next counterfactual is going to try to do slightly better than that in aggregate welfare terms, and this is implemented by a counterfactual that aims to maximize market potential. And what this means is that I take each pair of districts in the data and I rank those pairs according to their district pair level market potential, which is defined as the sum of their populations divided by the Euclidean distance between them. And so I go down this list in descending order of market potential of bilateral pairs, allocating one category upgrades until I run out of money, where the amount of money I have is defined by the total amount that was actually spent on the status quo. So again, all of the counterfactuals are designed to be cost neutral, but in this case, I'm allocating those upgrades in such a way as to try to maximize this market potential measure. The final two counterfactuals do exactly the same exercise. They try to maximize market potential, but amongst, one final point I want to make on this unconstrained market potential maximizing allocation is that, of course, this is a reasonably coastally concentrated allocation. That is by virtue of the fact that the market potential maximizing allocation is based on population as part of the definition of market access. And these areas, as we saw in an earlier motivating map, are very densely populated. So as we would expect, this allocation is somewhat coastally concentrated. But again, it turns out, it was not, this is not mechanically so, but it turns out that this is less concentrated in coastal areas relative to the status quo. And in particular, we see stronger concentration of upgrades, for instance, at these intermediate elevation areas extending further inland. So the final two counterfactuals are going to do exactly the same thing, so try to maximize market potential, but amongst a subset of districts that are less environmentally vulnerable. So in particular, the first of these is going to be an allocation that aims to maximize market potential only amongst the set of districts that lie outside the 5 meter low elevation coastal zone. So this is the region projected to see not only permanent inundation, but the wider effects of sea level rise associated with increasing high intensity typhoons and saltwater intrusion and land subsidence and so on. I think I see a hand.
Hi, so do you take, in this market potential counterfactuals, do you take into account like the category of the roads, like I understood you were doing the other two counterfactuals?
Yes, so in this case, there are obviously lots of ways one could implement this, and it's a priori difficult to sort of think about which of those are the best way to do it. So one could, favor very significant improvements on one stretch and lesser improvements on another, and so on. But the way in which I've implemented this is assign to each bilateral link a one category upgrade. So I'm only, and then keep going down the list, but only allowing for one category upgrade. So the implied road network you'll see has, in common with the some stretches of the realized network, we'll see some of these previously major roads upgraded to dual carriageways, and then the other stretches, it will depend on what the road was in 2000. If the road was a minor road in 2000, it will become a major road in 2010 and so on. That's obviously a choice, a modeling choice. There are other ways one could implement it. That's how this is implemented here.
Thanks.
So this is the market potential maximizing allocation constrained to avoid the 5 meter low elevation coastal zone. Of course, this is not at all concentrated in low-lying regions by definition. And then the final counterfactual allocation is somewhat intermediate between the last two. So this is the market potential maximizing allocation that is constrained to avoid only those very low-lying regions at less than 1 meter elevation that are projected to face permanent inundation. So in this case, it's again reasonably coastally concentrated, but some of the most low-lying regions do not see concentrations of upgrade because the allocation is constrained to avoid those. I should also say that in all of the counterfactuals, largely by virtue of the way in which I've implemented them, which consistent with the realized road upgrades is road upgrading rather than new stretches, there will be no districts entirely cut off here. So as the sea level rises, there will be no infinities in the trading cost matrix. Okay, so turning to the results of the counterfactual estimation. The first estimate here is the estimate of the welfare gains associated with the realized road upgrades. So in this central scenario, so all of these first set of results will be the central scenario with a 1 meter rise in the sea level realized gradually over the next 100 years. The central estimates will suggest that the net present value of aggregate welfare was 1.75% higher than it would have been had no investments been made in the road upgrades. So this, relative to estimates of sort of welfare gains implied by road infrastructure investments in the literature, is has sort of two key differences. The first is that this is allowing for the discounted value of future welfare gains. Apologies. In future periods. But set against that, it's also incorporating this effect that over time, the share of these investments that lie in regions that face inundation are going to be kind of rendered less and less useful as those investments in low-lying areas become inundated, and the net effect of those is going to be a 1.75% increase in the net present value of aggregate welfare associated with the realized upgrade. So this is going to outperform the simple rule of thumb counterfactual allocation that simply aims to connect all provinces. But the market potential maximizing allocation is going to strongly outperform the status quo. So what this is showing is that an allocation that doesn't specifically try to avoid coastal areas, but that nonetheless is much less coastally concentrated than the status quo, would have achieved welfare gains more than 50% higher. So in thinking about whether the last two bars here we would expect to be higher or lower than the unconstrained market potential maximizing allocation, there are two sort of offsetting potential factors. The first is that by construction, these are less concentrated in coastal areas prone to the effects of inundation, and therefore a smaller share of these upgrades is going to be lost to inundation, which we would expect to favour these. But set against this, in the near term, of course, these allocations are foregoing the gains associated with market access improvements in regions that we've seen are very densely populated, and so it's not clear which way we should expect them to go. So in the case of the first counterfactual, so the market potential maximizing allocation, avoiding the entire 5 meter low elevation coastal zone, the lateral effect is going to dominate. That's this still outperforms the status quo, but has lower welfare gains than the unconstrained market potential maximizing allocation. I should say that this is somewhat set up to be the case in the sense that in the counterfactuals simulations, I'm only modeling the effects of permanent inundation. And this is avoiding the full 5 meter zone, which is is projected to face a much wider set of damages associated with environmental change, but those are not incorporated in the model. So it's perfectly possible that, and these are of course very difficult to quantify, and where possible I've tried to be as conservative as possible in the estimation, which is why I'm only modeling the effects of sea level rise here. But it is of course quite possible that if we accounted for the full set of changes in the 5 meter low elevation coastal zone, we would see this reversed. But the final counterfactual suggests that it is this foresighted allocation that avoids the most vulnerable regions that are prone to permanent inundation over the next century that would have achieved the highest welfare gains. So this graph contains the same information, but here I've expressed all welfare gains relative to the welfare gains achieved by the status quo. This, again, is all of these results are in this central scenario of a 1 meter rise in the sea level realized gradually. But again, we saw that all of these counterfactuals were less coastally concentrated than the status quo. So there is some share of these unrealized gains that one might expect to be able to attribute to the lower environmental vulnerability in future periods. But there are, of course, as I mentioned, a series of other factors that we might expect could be feeding into this misallocation, which motivates this second series of counterfactuals, where I simulate the effects of all of these allocations, but in a scenario with no future sea level rise. And the results of that exercise are as follows, as shown in the orange bars here. So firstly, intuitively here, the highest performing allocation is going to be the unconstrained market potential maximizing allocation. That's as we'd hope, given that the constraint to avoid coastal zones is irrelevant in this case because there's no sea level rise. But the two key takeaways from this graph are firstly that even in the absence of future sea level rise, there appear to be very significant unrealized gains to alternative allocations of these road investments that are concentrated further inland. And so this came up a bit earlier, but I try to discuss in the paper some of the potential kind of political economy drivers of this. Overall, this is consistent with infrastructure investments being slow to respond to changing patterns of coastal advantage over time. There are other factors that one might expect to be important, in particular this sort of dual role of roads, firstly as a mobility investment that serves the existing population, but secondly as a placemaking investment that over time is important for the distribution of economic activity over space. And for instance, to a 4 or 5 year electoral horizon, we might expect different emphasis on one or other of those. There's a large literature, including Vietnam, that suggests that questions of political favoritism might also be important. So there are many important factors that might be feeding into this. I've sort of tempted to stray in that direction lots of times, but this is sort of estimating the relative contribution of these effects is beyond the scope of the paper, but I discuss a little bit some of the factors that might be contributing to this. But the second kind of key takeaway here is that once we account for the effects of environmental change, this very strongly accentuates the gains to more foresighted allocations, particularly those avoiding the most vulnerable regions. And so that's those are the sort of the key takeaways from the simulation results. Firstly, that there are these gains from allocating upgrades inland even without allowing for the effects of sea level rise, but secondly, that the future effects of inundation strongly accentuate the gains from avoiding the most vulnerable regions. Now, I mentioned at a couple of points in answer to questions that I try to implement some sort of extension exercise to consider alternative explanations here. So in many ways that I've tried to outline, the estimation aims to be quite conservative about projected effects of future climate change and so on. What I emphasize here is factors that might go in the other direction, and in particular, factors that we might expect help to rationalize this observed allocation that the central estimate suggests is an inefficient degree of coastal favoritism in the distribution of the investments. So a couple of these we've touched on. So to the extent that coastal regions have particular advantages for international trade, that's already in the central estimates. But again, to the extent that the importance of that is increasing over time, it's not. So I make these extreme assumptions, essentially that the very, very high rates of international export growth observed over the study period continue into the future. That's not going to break these two central results. The second is the coastal amenity premium that we've discussed. So the fact that people might prefer coastal regions for one reason or another is already incorporated, but the fact that the importance of this coastal amenity premium might increase over time, for instance, as the development level increases, is not. So I run that simulation that doesn't overturn the key results either. The final factor I consider here is that the central estimates hold fixed the calibrated productivity values in each district over time. There are, of course, lots of reasons to expect that it's not that productivity across space will change over time. I would say that To the extent we expect important secular trends to continue, so for instance, secular change out of structural change out of agriculture towards manufacturing and services, that might be expected to reinforce these patterns to the extent that agriculture is very coastally concentrated. But it might be the case that there are other trends that are important, the growth of coastal tourism or some very specific pattern of productivity growth in important coastal regions, for instance. So I just let the data speak on this one. What I do is to recalibrate the model in the year 2000 and take a district-specific calibrated productivity trend from 2000 to 2010 and project that forward and resimulate the model in that case. And that's not going to overturn the key results either. I think there's something happening in the chat. Is that a question? Oh no, okay. That looks like a notification.
The next tree seminar. Sorry for the distraction.
No. I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions.
So I actually do have a question, if I may.
Sure.
And you were careful to show us where sea level rise is entering into your welfare calculations, and I've somewhat forgotten. So I have two questions. One is, are these welfare calculations reflecting the fact that these investments along the coast and roadways could be recruiting migrants to the coast, and that their land will then be inundated under sea level rise? Question one. Question two is, to what extent the model accounts for efforts to protect roadways that would be inundated, or to repair roadways that are inundated?
So in answer to your first question, yes, that is one part of the mechanism. The second part of the mechanism is that those people have moved to the coast, and not only does the land supply contract, but it also becomes more costly to use the roads in those areas. So the cost of trade to those areas also increases because the roads become inundated. To the second question, yes, this is really important, and this is where I sort of initially thought the paper was going to go. So I think this is where this graph is particularly insightful, in that what I had expected to find was that, look, once we account for the fact that these roads are going to be underwater, it's not terribly sensible to be building the roads on the coast, but in the near term, these are the really valuable areas, and so there's some trade-off there. In that case, there would have been this very real trade-off between investing on the coast and investing to protect those investments with seawalls and so on, versus investing further inland because of the future gains. In fact, what these orange bars are showing is that even without sea level rise, there are unrealized gains to investing further inland. So in this world, in fact, investing on the coast with the accompanying adaptive investments would only amplify these effects. But that I think is kind of an interesting finding here, and again, one that was quite surprising to me.
Sure, but I guess I'm looking at, if you can go back to that slide, the second orange bar, and comparing that to the fourth orange bar. So the second has more investments on the coast, of course, and these are investments that are at risk of being inundated from sea level rise.
But not in the world of the orange bar, there is no sea level rise. So these estimates are only valid if there is no sea level rise.
Right, and so I guess my point is that the investments that aren't constrained to avoid those areas yield higher welfare gains than the investments that are outside the 1 meter coastal zone.
If there's no sea level rise, yes.
Right.
Yes, exactly. I think there's another hand.
Yes. Kind of following up a little bit on what Steve was asking. So you have migration in the model. I mean, that's kind of one of the features, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I'm just wondering, do people move as easily as the model predicts? And is there a way to simulate what happens if they don't move that easily? And is that useful to do?
So the migration costs are calibrated from observed migration between 2005 and 2010. So the calibrated migration costs will be quite high because migration flows are quite low. So it's capturing the actual variation in migration over that time period. What it is not capturing, and in fact the model imposes constancy of the migration costs across time. What it's not capturing is you know, if there's some reason to expect that it will suddenly become very much less costly to migrate in the future, then of course these effects are going to matter less, because it doesn't matter so much. It will be much cheaper for people to move out than it is now. I haven't modeled that, and I don't think there's necessarily an intuitive reason to suspect that that would be the case. But it's true that the migration costs are calibrated using data, but they're calibrating using data from the present. So it doesn't capture potential changes in the migration costs over time.
And that's like spatially differentiated costs? So like...
Yeah.
So
bilateral. So the data is on bilateral pair migration flows.
So Claire, we're just 2 minutes past the end, so I want to give you a chance to conclude, and then
I was going to skip the robustness test anyway, but I'd point you to a extremely lengthy appendix if you're interested in any of those. But yes, just to conclude, the central result of the paper here is that reversal in coastal fortune reinforced by environmental change has very important implications for where to allocate infrastructure today. The two key results we've just discussed, but I just want to end here on this really enormous number of people that live on land below sea level, or that will be below sea level or chronic flood levels by the end of the century. That's suggesting that these types of considerations are going to be increasingly important in thinking about where to allocate infrastructure in the future. So my apologies for overrunning a bit, but thank you very much indeed for your comments and questions.
Sure. So Claire, if you're willing to stick around for a few more questions that our seminar attendees may have, that would be great. But let's all thank Claire for a wonderful seminar.
Thank you.
And let me again plug the next tree seminar, which will be October 8th with Renato Molina from the University of Miami. The link to register for that seminar is in the chat. So thank you everyone for coming. Claire, thanks again for a great presentation. And anyone else who has questions or wants to listen in on other questions or discussion is welcome to stick around.